We try to stay a step or two ahead here because we want to affect events, not just talk about them, although that's required sometimes too. I spent a lot of time on the War Powers Act and the Constitution. I'll revisit that a little later. But there's something very interesting and positive occurring in the United States Senate among the Republicans. Now, if you read Liberty and Tyranny, you know that I strongly urged in the Conservative Manifesto section passage of a constitutional amendment of the kind that Milton Friedman proposed many years ago, and others supported, like Tom Sowell and Walter Williams and so forth, limiting the percentage of the economy, that is, the percentage of the gross domestic product that the government could take from us, and also building in supermajority requirements for Congress to raise taxes and to go beyond that percentage of the gross domestic product, often in times of military conflict, which was the only exception that Milton Friedman believed in as well. I also said 6 weeks ago, and we had Senator Hatch on here, who has spearheaded this for decades, actually, we need to have an amendment like this and force something like this if there's going to be a vote to raise the debt limit. And frankly, given the Republicans in the House and the fact that the Democrats control the Senate, that is the Republican leadership in the House, I feel that's the best we can do. But if we can get this amendment passed in both houses of Congress, and it requires 2/3 votes, and it goes directly to the state legislatures, it bypasses Obama, this would be an incredibly important event towards reestablishing constitutional government. This is something Friedman talked about all the time. He wrote about it, mentioned it in at least 2 of his books. This is something our economists who believe in the Constitution have been preaching for decades. This is something Ronald Reagan talked about. This is something I've written about and have talked about. Now, I'm not a Pollyanna. I don't think this will happen overnight. But it's like the fair tax or the flat tax. If we are prepared to make the case to the American people, and if we can get the bulk, if not the majority, if not all, of the Republicans in the House and the Senate supporting it, and if we can take the Senate back in the next round and win the presidency, I feel we can do great things and take great steps in the right direction. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to require you. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the Balanced Budget Amendment. I don't really like that name, but that's what they call it, because it's more than the Balanced Budget Amendment. It should be called Limit the Size of Government under the Constitution Amendment, but that's okay. That's what it is. Now, the first to break this story about a possible joining of different proposals, which may actually get 47 Republican senators to support it, all of them, our friends at Human Events. And by the way, if you don't get Human Events is a great newspaper. It was Ronald Reagan's favorite. Emily Miller, their congressional correspondent, broke this story. And she tells us that Senate Republicans are preparing to tell President Obama that they want a balanced budget amendment, BBA, to the Constitution passed in Congress in exchange for raising the statutory debt ceiling above $14.2 trillion. John Cornyn told Human Events, "My hope is that we would force a vote on a balanced budget amendment as a condition to voting on the debt ceiling. By next week or shortly thereafter, we will have all 47 Republicans unified behind the effort and then begin to reach out to our Democratic colleagues. The balanced budget amendment, follow this, would force the federal government to balance the federal spending to incoming revenue each year and cap spending at 18% of the gross domestic product. For the current fiscal year, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects the government spending will be $1.4 trillion more than revenue and account for almost 25% of the gross domestic product. Actually, I believe that's been increased to 1.65. But trillion here, 100 billion there. Now, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is planning to roll out the details of the new version of the Balanced Budget Amendment in the next 2 weeks. His plan is to build public support and pressure on Democrats to vote for it before the debt ceiling is hit, which is estimated to happen between mid-April and the end of May. Cornyn said, "We will have a genuine rollout so the American people can know what we're doing, and they can call and email and fax and demand their senators and congressmen support it, and create a true grassroots effort. But I want to tell you something, folks. We're in on this because this is an idea we've been talking about. And if they want to do this, by God, we are going to be the wind at their back. So far, the Republicans have at least 33 members supporting the new balanced budget amendment. Cornyn said that he and others are making calls this week to line up the others to support it. He expects to have all 47 Republicans in support next week, and then we'll start outreach to Senate Democrats. According to Article 5 of the Constitution, an amendment must get a two-thirds vote in both the House and Senate and be ratified by three-quarters of the states. So in the Democrat majority Senate, the amendment would need all 47 Republicans plus 20 Democrats for passage. Now, the congressional GOP has said that it will not allow Obama to borrow more money for government spending without significant reforms to the budget process and deficit reduction. Cornyn said McConnell has declared that he thinks that no Republican would vote to increase the debt ceiling without some real fiscal reforms. To my mind, he says, a vote on a balanced budget amendment would be a minimum requirement before we have that vote. These guys are talking the right way, and they seem to be organizing the right way. And at least in the Senate, it sounds like they're developing a very solid strategy from Mark's point of view when it comes to the debt ceiling. Some have said to me, well, just vote against the debt ceiling, the hell with it. Well, then it's going to pass because we don't have enough strength in the House to hold. You saw what they did already. And we don't have enough votes in the Senate to get it. So we need to grab for what we can, press the case, and as I've been saying, and as these men and women apparently are aware of, we need to make our case to the American people, which we have not been. The new Senate version of the balanced budget amendment stipulates a spending limit so that annual outlays for any fiscal year cannot exceed 18% of the gross domestic product. That is 18% of all goods and services produced in a given year. This year, the Congressional Budget Office projects government spending will be 24.7, almost 25% of the gross domestic product. In 2010, outlays were almost 24%. This is significant, folks. Under the balanced budget amendment, Congress would need a vote of two-thirds of the House and Senate to pass a budget over 18% of the GDP, and the specific excess would be specified in the bill. Also, the Senate's balanced budget requirement would stipulate that total annual government spending cannot exceed total revenue unless two-thirds of the House and the Senate vote for a specific spending excess amount. So you need a supermajority. A supermajority. So there's two checks. It cannot go over 18% of GDP, and it cannot increase, the spending cannot exceed revenue unless you get a two-thirds vote of both houses. In addition, the balanced budget amendment states that in order to increase the debt limit in the future, you'd need 3/5 of both chambers to pass it. Now, the Senate balanced budget amendment attempts to prevent Washington from cooking the books, too, by defining outlays as all spending except for repayment of debt principal, and receipts as all revenue except from borrowing. What's happening here is there are really two amendments being proposed, the Hatch Amendment and the Kyle Rand Paul Amendment and Mike Lee Amendment. And what they've done is they've gotten together and they have modified it so they come up with one amendment. And one of the things I like about it is it takes that percentage of gross domestic product down from 20% to 18%. There are two waivers in the proposed amendment. First, the spending limit provision. 18% of GDP can be waived when a declaration of war against a nation state is in effect and where majority of both houses provide by law for a specific excess by a roll call vote. Second, the spending limit in the balanced budget requirement can be waived when the U.S. is engaged in military conflict, which causes imminent and serious military threat to national security and declared by a joint resolution that is approved by 3/5 vote of each house. Every battle is not a declaration of war battle. They recognize that, and they still require a supermajority for an exception. So the two camps came together, reports Human Events, to compile the provisions of the compromise, Hatch, Lee, Cornyn, Kyle, Toomey, and Olympia Snow balanced budget amendment. And they're still working out some of the details. So the bottom line is they're going to need two-thirds of both houses. And then it goes to the states where they need 3/5. So just checking here to make sure I have everything. 3/5. 3/4, I meant. Senator Hatch, who's been fighting for this fiscal restraint since 1979, tells Human Events a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution's time has more than come. And he's right. Now, look, I said I'm not a Pollyanna, neither are you. We know how Washington works. You can see what's going on even in Wisconsin and Ohio and other places. How the people who oppose the Constitution, the people who oppose fiscal sanity, dig in and fight like hell. So when I saw this in Human Events today, I was inspired by it. You may disagree with one aspect of it or another. The fact of the matter is, if this were the law of the land today in the United States Constitution, our country would look very different. It would be healthier, our government would be smaller, and it makes it a hell of a lot more difficult to be just developing entitlement programs and expanding entitlement programs and redistributing wealth and taking over state authority. This is crucial. This isn't the end all. But let me tell you, this is more than a first step. If we can get this done over a period of a few years, this is more than a first step. This is a huge step. And as I said, it was one that the great, late Milton Friedman strongly supported, and he was right. And it's also one of the major aspects of the conservative manifesto. I called it that in the book, just to take a slap at Marx, in Liberty and Tyranny. So we will be poised here in the Levin audience on the Levin show to get behind this effort. Now, if we're snookered, we're going to be on the lookout for that too. We're going to see if this is just a fan dance. But I suspect it's not. Doesn't mean they can get it passed. But it also means we can continue to change the makeup of the House and the Senate. And if, by God, we need supermajorities to get things done, then we damn well better make them supermajorities. We'll be right back.